In the last video in this series, we talked about transformation in Blender, basically rotating, scaling, or moving things. If you didn't catch the last video on transformation, then I recommend going back and watching that. Even if you're fairly familiar with transformation in Blender, there's a lot of really awesome tips tucked away in that video. So after recording that the other day, I came up with what I thought would be a really fun challenge and a good way for us to hammer the concepts we learned in the last video into our head. So if you bring up your add menu by either pressing Shift A, or you can double right click as well, under the mesh menu here, there are these 8 very simple, basic, primitive shapes, starting from plane going down to the torus. So my question is, what can we make using nothing but these 8 simple shapes and our transform skills? So that means we can use any of these top 8 objects, such as this cylinder, or this cone, or this torus shape, and we can transform these in whatever way we want. So rotating, scaling, or moving them, as well as transforming them while constraining them. So I could press S to scale, then middle mouse to constrain, and point my mouse up towards the Z-axis here so it scales vertically like this. So I could do something like that. Or say I could select this cube and make it into something like this. But no going and editing stuff in edit mode, which we haven't really talked about the difference between object mode and edit mode just yet. We're going to save that for another video. But for more advanced users, part of this challenge is that you cannot go into edit mode and then say edit part of your shape here, or say extrude something out and what have you. So we want to see what can we accomplish using nothing but these primitive shapes and our mad transform skills. At the end, I'm going to walk you through performing a basic render, and then I'm going to post my creation on the Crash Course forum at blendersensei.com, and I'd be really excited to see anything that other people make as well. I'm probably going to be rendering this in Blender Render, but you can feel free to render it in Cycles, whichever you want. Also allowed will be using smooth shading if you want to, so you can add that to any of your objects. And if you know how to use lamps and lighting in Blender, feel free to use that in the challenge as well, with the exception of using any kinds of colored lights. So just make sure they're on a scale from white to black, and you're not using any colors like red, green, or whatever. And then obviously basic things like duplicating objects is also fine for the challenge, as well as any other stuff you see me do in this video when I'm making my own entry to the challenge. Obviously that's okay to do because I made up the challenge. So I'm going to be making a sort of an outdoor scene with a house and a fence, I think, but you can feel free to, make weapons. Like you could make some kind of cool sword, or like a crazy gun with all kinds of barrels, or maybe something simple like a table or some sort of weird vehicle. The sky's the limit. So before I get started with my entry into the challenge, I want to talk about just a handful of things that are going to tie in with the stuff we learned in the last video that will really give you a big advantage down the road when it comes to transforming things. So I'm going to go to File, press New, and reload startup file so I can reset my scene and everything. So a really important topic that we didn't really talk about when we went over transformations in the last video were how transformations behave relative to an object's origin point. So the origin point of an object in the 3D view is just that little orange dot sitting in the object. So right now, actually, the 3D cursor, the little red and white lifesaver looking thing, is on top of the origin point, but if I right click and move it over here somewhere, you can see that little orange dot sitting in this object when we have it selected, when it's highlighted in orange. So if I were to double right click over here and say add a cone, or double right click over here and say add a torus, and double right click here and say add a cylinder, whenever we click on one of these objects, you'll see this little orange dot in the middle of them. That orange dot is called the object's origin point. And it's sort of a similar concept in a lot of programs. So Photoshop has something like this, Illustrator has something like this, a lot of programs, and sometimes it's referred to as pivot point or center point, but basically it means whenever we're transforming stuff, rotating, scaling, and what have you, that those transformations take place relative to where that origin point is. And we'll be discussing the origin point a lot more in a future video, as well as the other stuff I'm about to quickly tell you about before we get started with this challenge. But it'd be good if you had like a basic outline of what these things do before we move forward. So right now, if I press S to scale, notice that when I scale in really small, this cylinder gets real close to that orange dot because it's scaling to and from that orange dot. However, we can move that orange dot, the origin point, real simply. If we hold Shift and right-click somewhere on our cylinder, then we can snap the 3D cursor to any part of this object's mesh. And the mesh is the gray matter stuff inside of the object. It's what actually makes this object up. It's all the 3D polygon faces that compose this thing. So if I were to Shift right-click to here, it would snap to this edge. Or if I Shift right-click here, the cursor would snap to that little vertex point. Or if we Shift right-click in the middle of a polygon face, it will snap to the middle of it. However, if we Shift and double right-click, that will change the origin point of that object. So I'll hold Shift, double right-click. Now the origin point of this object is set to the top here. So notice what happens now when we scale this object. It scales entirely to and from that point on the top. Same thing when we go to rotate it. So it's going to be real interested in where that origin point is. So let me take a second to tell you an old man story because I'm getting closer to being an old man. And it's about the first time I ever started using Blender. And the first time I started using Blender, I had this real simple goal. I wanted to be able to make a door and animate it opening and closing. And I found this so frustrating that after days of trying, I quit using Blender for years. If only I had understood a few core concepts about how transformation works, then I would have kept on. Right now, if I were to select this cube and press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and flatten it up, and then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and point my mouse along the Z-axis. And of course, once you've got it going the way you want, you can let go of that middle mouse button and just move the mouse. And I could click. So if I had something shaped like a door here, and I wanted to rotate this like a door, right now if I try to rotate this, well, if I don't constrain that rotation, it's just going to go anywhere. But I could either tap Z on my keyboard to get it to rotate vertically, or I could, of course, click down on my middle mouse button and just point this towards the direction I want to rotate. So right now it's not rotating very much like a door. So the way we would do that is move this origin point to a place where it would cause this to rotate like a door. So can you guess where that origin point needs to go? Correct, it needs to go over here. So if we Shift double right click over here, that will move this object's origin point to the center of this plane here. Now if I press R to rotate and then constrain this rotation with either holding middle mouse or tapping Z, notice it is now rotating like a door. Well, almost. Probably it would be better if that origin point, instead of in the middle of that thing, was actually on this edge, and then it would be a lot closer to what we wanted. So what we can do is, if we hold Shift and right click on this edge, we'll see this cursor snap to the center of that edge. Once again, if we want the origin to move there, we can hold Shift and double right click. And now when we press R to rotate, and then constrain it along the axis we want, like this, it's behaving much more like we would want a door to rotate. Of course, if you know that what you've got here is a door and you don't want to have to constrain this thing every time you rotate it, you want it to rotate the same way every time, you can always press T under Dimensions, where it says Rotation. You can lock all of the axes except for Z, which we've been having to constrain every time after we press R to rotate, which sucks. So let's lock these up. Now when we press R to rotate, this thing will never behave like anything other than a door. So cool. So we've got one more area to cover before we dive into the challenge that's going to really tie in all this cool stuff you've been learning about transformation, and that is this pivot point menu. Now, a lot of what this menu really exists for is to help you handle transformations when dealing with multiple objects. So up until now, we've basically been transforming just one object at a time, but this really helps you manage situations where you need to transform a bunch of stuff you have selected at once. But we're going to briefly go over each one of these options here, just so you have a basic reference point in the future and you're a little bit better prepared. So the first thing that you'll notice about these top two options, active element and medium point, is that they behave exactly the same if you only have one object selected. So like I said, a lot of this menu is about how do we deal with transforming multiple objects at a time. So if I switch this to active element and I click on this cylinder up here, if I press S to scale, notice that it will scale exactly the same as medium point. However, when this is set on medium point, which is what it's set to by default, and we select multiple objects, so say I press shift and click on all these, so we've got all four of these objects selected here. With this set to medium point, what this does, if you're dealing with more than one object, which it will then transform around that object's little origin point, is Blender will make up a estimated center point of whatever objects you have selected. So when we do a transformation like rotation, we press R to rotate. Notice that this happens around the center of these objects. Also notice that that door is totally wigging out as we rotate, which is kind of cool. Why that's happening is because we locked X and Y. And when you lock a location, rotation, or scale transform point, Blender is really serious about not letting that object rotate in those directions, which is good. But let's go ahead and unclick those so that it doesn't look weird when we're rotating all these at once. Okay, so if I shift select back on all these, press R to rotate, or if I were to press S to scale, they're all going to transform around that made up center location. So if I just had, say, this object and this object selected by shift selecting that, and I press S to scale, notice that the made up transform point, the medium point, midpoint if you will, is somewhere in the center between those objects. Actually, what it is the medium point transforms around the exact center between the origin points. So it's really between this object's origin point and this object's origin point that it figures out the center to use when you transform stuff. So a minute ago, I was showing you how you can change an object's origin point. That's just one way you can. Say, for instance, I were to select this door and I wanted to set its origin point not even on the object, just somewhere crazy like way over here. You can do that by right-clicking and putting your 3D cursor wherever you want it to go. And then up here where it says Set Origin, we can click this and click to 3D cursor. And that will change the origin point of the selected object to where that 3D cursor is. Now if I press R to rotate, S to scale, it's all doing it towards that crazy origin point way over there. But notice also now, we have this set on medium point. If I shift select this and then I press R to rotate, notice that that's not exactly between the center of that object and that object. It's like now it's way over here because what it actually considers to be the medium point is the center of all the things it selected's origin points, which makes sense when you're looking for the center of that dot and that dot. But I'm going to quickly reset this object's origin point by coming up here and under Set Origin, selecting to Object Center, and that will put it back to the object's exact center point. If we set this to Active Element, and we have more than one object selected, otherwise these two guys behave exactly the same. And now I have all these objects selected, so if I were to press R to rotate, notice they're all rotating around that cylinder, or rather that cylinder's origin point that it owns. And that's because everything will transform now around the active object. And so typically your active object in Blender is the last object that you have selected. So usually if you just have one object selected, that object is your active object because it's the last object you have selected. Another way you can always tell what your active object is that here in the outliner, which that's what this little editor type is called, the actual text of the object will be orange. So as you can see, this cone object here, its text is orange. There's also a little orange spotlight on top of it, but that just means that it's also selected. So if I were to shift select all of these up here, notice now that there's a little spotlight next to the icons of all these objects, but only one, the text is orange. And that orange text is the active object, which is also always the last object you selected or shift selected, which was that cylinder just now. So because this is set to active element, our pivot point, everything's going to transform in our selection of stuff around that active object. But we could shift select this cone, and now the cone has become the active object because it was last selected. So if we press R to rotate, notice everything's happening around the cone because it's now the star of the show. So if we switch this from active element or medium point, which we talked about, to individual origins, this will handle all of the selected objects as though we're transforming them individually. If I press S to scale now, they'll all scale towards their own individual little origin points. And so if I press R to rotate, they'll all do that towards their individual origin points. If we set this to 3D cursor, then this will let us manually decide where we want our transform point to be by setting the 3D cursor. So I could move it over here. Now if I press R to rotate, everything's going to rotate around that cursor. Or if I move it over here, it's going to rotate around there, or S to scale, or any kind of transform, which is what this is all about. Transforming multiple objects is going to happen around that 3D cursor. Finally, we have the bounding box center, which what this will do is pretend like everything you have selected is one single object. And as far as the farthest object that goes left goes, or the farthest object that goes right goes, the farthest object that goes up and down, basically it will create an imaginary box to create a transform point at the center of it. So it's similar to bounding box center is similar to medium point, which is usually what we leave this on by default, but it's not concerned about creating an exact center between all these little origin points. It's pretending like the whole thing is one object. All right, we are now well prepared to take on this challenge, so let's get started. First thing I want to do is move this cube up flush with the grid. So I'm going to press G to grab, and I could hold my middle mouse button down to constrain it. But that's not really necessary when you only have to move something a small ways. So instead of doing that, I'm just going to press G to grab and then hold Control to temporarily enable grid snapping. Then all I have to do is move my mouse up a little bit and the object will go right where I want it to. Next, what I want to do is squish this default cube down to sort of make a starting platform, and I'm going to put a building on top of it. If I start scaling this right now and then I hold my middle mouse button down to constrain, this will squish the cube like I want, only once I'm finished, I'm going to have to move it back down to be flush with the grid again. So I don't want to have to do that. So I'm going to press Ctrl Z to undo that. And instead, I'm going to change the location of this cube's origin point. So whenever I do transformations on it, they all go towards where that point is. So I would like that to be at the bottom of this cube. So I'm going to rotate the screen so I can look at the bottom of the cube, and then I'm going to hold Shift and double right click down here on this bottom face of this cube. Now this cube's origin point is down here. So if I press S to scale and hold middle mouse to constrain vertically, I can now scale this out really easily and then not have to move it once I'm done. All right, I'm going to press D to duplicate this and get it to where it's sitting close to the top of the object it was duplicated from. Then I'm going to go ahead and press S to scale it. Maybe scale it out a little bit more. Then I'm going to shift select this, hold D to duplicate, middle mouse to constrain, and set it somewhere pretty close to the top of that other one. You can sort of see what I'm doing here. And I'll just hold Shift to select all these again. I'll tap Z to make sure I've got everything selected. There it is, all in its orange glory. And I'll duplicate this one more time. I'll press D to duplicate, middle mouse to constrain, and S to scale. And so now I've got sort of a platform of steps here. Next, I'm going to press Shift C to recenter my 3D cursor back to the center of the grid. I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a plane. Press S to scale. So I've got sort of a ground here. Now it's getting a little difficult to see everything going on with this default solid viewport shading. So what I'm going to do is press T to bring up my tool shelf. And under the Builder menu, I'm going to turn on High Def Shading. And what that does is it activates shadows coming from the available lamps in the scene, and it also turns on an ambient occlusion effect that's just for working in the 3D view workspace. So basically just an effect to make it easier for us to model, and it's not going to show up when we go to render. However, if we come down here and under lights, we turn on ambient here, and I could make this a bit darker by increasing this ambient value. If I turn it on ambient occlusion here, then when I go to render something, so long as I am in Blender render, then when I press render to render this out, we'll see the effects of this ambient occlusion in our actual rendered image. So notice if I come down here and I turn ambient off and then render this out again, if we switch between slot 2 to slot 1, you can see this is with the ambient occlusion and this is without. That effect is only available while you are in Blender render mode down here. As this menu mentions here where it says lighting Blender render, you have some different options if you are in Cycles render mode, and we'll get into all this stuff in the future. Just want you to be aware that when you turn on this high def shading option here, that it's not going to render out. It's just basically a helpful way to visualize what you're modeling. Also, this high def shading mode requires Blender render to be able to display, in addition to the ambient occlusion, the shadows from light. So if I were to pick this object up and press G to grab, you can see the shadows casting down there across those other steps. And that's only available while you're in Blender render mode. So if you're using Cycles and you activate this option, it will temporarily switch you over to Blender render. But if you turn it off, it will switch you back to Cycles if you are using Cycles before you turned it on. Just so you're aware of that. So I'll press Control Z to undo movement of that top little step there. Now what I'm going to do is go ahead and press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. And I'm going to go ahead and turn this top step into my building. I'm going to press S to scale and not constrain it at all this time, just so there'll be a little bit of space up there. Next, what I want to do is put some kind of roof on this little building. So since we're limited to only using these top 8 simple primitive shapes, and we're not allowed to go press tab and go into edit mode and do anything to our mesh, what I'm going to do is hold shift and right click onto the top of this cube here, and that will snap my cursor to the center of whatever piece of that object's mesh it was closest to. So for instance, if I were to hold shift and right click near here, it would snap to the center of that edge, or if I were to hold shift and right click here, it would snap to that vertex point. But I'll shift and right click it near the center so it will snap to the dead center of the top of that face. And then I'm going to press Shift A, and under Mesh, I'm going to add another cube, which is really big. So I'm going to press S to scale that down. And I don't normally like using this 3D manipulator widget, but there are times when it's pretty useful. So I'm going to click this to turn that on. And by default, I have the location and rotation parts of the widget available, as you can see if I click on one or the other. And they're both activated there because I have Shift held down, which keeps them up at the same time. And what I'm going to do is press 1 to go into front view, and I'm going to click and drag this to rotate it, and I'm going to hold Control so that it snaps and rotates perfectly like this. And so when I click my middle mouse button to get out of that front view, we can see we've sort of got something representing a pitched roof. I'm going to press S to scale that and make sure it sits inside here. And I'm going to go ahead and dismiss my widget because I don't need it. And then I'm going to press S to scale again, middle mouse to constrain, stretch this out a little bit to where it fills more of the side of that building. And so now what I'd like to do is to stretch this out to where this, what we're using for the roof, scales out vertically along the Z-axis. The only problem is now, if I press S to scale and middle mouse to constrain, it's not quite doing what I want it to anymore. There's two things you can try whenever you're having trouble with transforming things. The first thing I recommend is switching this from global to normal and see if that works. So let's press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and nope, it's basically doing the same thing. That's not what we want it to, so I'll switch that back to global. And the second thing is to try applying all of these transformations to your object. And that concept might seem a little bit strange. We're not going to really dive too much into it, but if things aren't working, you should try coming to this menu and pressing Apply All, and close that up, and let's press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and hooray, it's now doing what we want it to. It's scaling out vertically. So I'm just going to make that a little higher like that. And I'm also going to come down here and to my camera area and just adjust my camera a little bit. I always like to have sort of a working angle of whatever I'm working on down here in the director's chair area, if I'm not also using this window as a second view to help me select things or do other editing work. Well, now I want to make a fence around this thing. By default, if we right-click on an object, the 3D cursor will automatically snap to that object's origin point, and if we shift right-click, it will automatically snap to the nearest piece of mesh that it is closest to. But sometimes for objects like this giant plane, which is only made of one single face, if I press Z to go into wireframe, it's just this single face here. Sometimes if we want to move the cursor to a location on it, we'll need to temporarily disable cursor snapping, and we can do that by holding Alt and then right-clicking our mouse somewhere to drag our 3D cursor. Then we can just let go and it will stay there. If you want to fully disable 3D cursor snapping, which is a product of Sensei format, you can come here and you can always press this button and your 3D cursor will behave normally as it does in Blender. Also, this is a good time to mention that the explanations for these different tools are really verbose, so if you're curious about these, you can always come and let your mouse hover over one of these things and read all about it. I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a cylinder shape. Then I'm going to press S to scale this on way down because this is going to be sort of a fence post. Then I'll press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. And very similarly to the way that we changed the origin point of this initial cube object down here to make working with it more easy, we're going to do the same thing with this cylinder. So right now, whenever we scale or rotate, all of these transformations are happening around the center of this, what's going to be a post. But it would make things a lot easier if that were happening from the bottom of this post. So what I'm going to do is hold Shift and then double right click down here, and that will set this cylinder shape's origin point to the bottom. Now when I press S to scale and hold middle mouse to constrain, I can easily decide how I want the height of this without having it move around all over the place. So I'll press S to scale the overall thing down a little bit, and then G to grab, middle mouse to constrain to have it sitting in the ground there, and then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to bring it up a little bit. Okay, I'm going to press 5 to go into top view and sort of decide where I want this to go. I think it's about there. That's pretty good. I'm going to hold Alt and tap middle mouse to quickly zoom in onto this object here. And I think I'll scale it down just a little bit more and then scale middle mouse up to constrain. And I'm going to shift right click up here, which will snap this 3D cursor to the center of that top face there. And I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a UV sphere, which is the default one is really big, so we'll press S to scale this down. It's really big compared to what we're making, I guess. I'll press S to scale this down, and over here I'm going to turn on smooth shading for it, and I'm going to press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. I'm going to give it a bit of an oblong shape like that. Then I'm going to press Shift A, and under Mesh I'm going to add a torus shape, which once again, its default one is really big compared to what we're doing, so I'll scale it down. And I'll go ahead and add smooth shading to that as well. I'm going to press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to make this a little bit wider like that. So I want to use smooth shading on this cylinder shape, but to see it a lot better, I'm going to need to temporarily disable high def shading there. And so right now, if I were to just press smooth on this, it kind of does an overkill smoothing effect on this cylinder. So what I'm going to use instead, I'll press flat first, is this auto smoothing feature. And when we activate this, rather than pressing smooth directly, we get this slider which lets us control the angle at which smooth shading occurs on the actual faces that make up the object. So you can see if I put this too high, it looks like it does when you default press smooth. And if I drop it way too low, then we get almost no shading effect at all. But the default level it's set at, which is about 32, is really good, or somewhere near there. Okay, I think I'm going to scale this down even a little bit more. And S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to bring it up. And yeah, I like how that looks a little bit better. So I'm going to shift select all of this. I'm going to press D to duplicate, middle mouse to constrain, and bring it over. Then I'm going to select one of these poles, and I'm going to use it as the bar that goes across. And this is another one of those situations where the widget might be the most useful for quickly making a change like this. So I'm going to press D to duplicate this, and then right click, which will, after I press D to duplicate it, it immediately snapped it back to its original location. So I'm going to press this to bring it up. And then I'm going to press 3 to go into left view. And I'm going to click this to rotate it. And I'm going to hold Control to snap it as I rotate it so I can get it exactly flat like that, which is nice. And now when I tap my middle mouse button to exit that left view and back into a perspective view, I can go ahead and get rid of this because I no longer need it. So I'll shut that off. And since we set the origin of this original object down to its bottom, of course that carried over on the object we duplicated. Having that origin point there for this object is just as useful as having it at the bottom for its original object, because now when we press S to scale and middle mouse to constrain, we get this nice simple way to control this like this. So I'm going to press S to scale the whole thing all together, make it a bit smaller, and then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and then bring it to where it meets with this other bar. Then I'm going to press D to duplicate it and middle mouse to constrain, and so now I've got the beginnings of a fence here. So I'm going to go ahead and turn high def shading back on because it makes working a little nicer. What I'm going to do now is shift select this other bar. And occasionally, if I'm not sure that I have everything that I want selected, or if I've got something too much selected, I will tap Z to enter wireframe. And this is just a quick way to make sure you only have the things selected you want. Then I'll press Z to go back into solid viewport shading. And what I'm going to do is press S to scale these, then Y to constrain them. Then I'm going to press the number 2, which will scale them out exactly twice the length that they were a second ago. This way, once I select all of these pieces of the fence, I can easily duplicate them and it will sort of create like a chain linked effect. So what I'm going to do is rotate my screen around to where it's easy to select just these pieces I want. And I'm going to press B to do a border select and click and drag it over these objects here until it selects them. Now when I press D to duplicate this, they'll meet up perfectly with the other pieces. And this is really the way we want to do this, since part of this challenge is we're not using any modifiers or anything like that. So I'm going to press B and select all of these again. Tap Z to make sure I got everything I want selected and nothing I don't want selected. Press D to duplicate all of that again. And it's looking pretty good. Okay, so I'm getting to the point where I need to make the front part of this fence, but I definitely don't want to go through duplicating all that stuff again piece by piece. So what I'm going to do is come down here and adjust my view to where I can do an easy border select by pressing B and select all of these pieces. Tap Z real quick to make sure I have only selected what I want selected. So right now would be a good time to set this pivot point option to the 3D cursor. So if the 3D cursor is set back to the center of this pole here, and I press D to duplicate all this stuff, and then right click to immediately snap all the new stuff I just duplicated back to its original location. So I mean, it looks like the duplicated objects are gone, but they're still there. They're just sitting precisely on top of everything I just duplicated. So now I can press 5 to go into top view. And since we set this pivot point to 3D cursor, when I press R to rotate and I hold Control to constrain, I can very easily, perfectly get the rotation I need for all these pieces. Then I can press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and bring it up here to be the finishing part of this angle of the fence. So just a second ago, we were using the position of this 3D cursor to help us rotate this big chunk of fence when it was actually sitting on top of its original thing it was duplicated from. So we had changed this from medium point to 3D cursor. But whenever you change one of these options here and you're done using it, you need to make sure that you switch it back to whatever you had it on. Otherwise, for instance, right now, if we were trying to scale or something, this fence, it would not do what we want because it's still using that 3D cursor as its transform point. So I'll right click to cancel that. So just make sure you switch this back to whatever you had it on, which by default, it's usually medium point, which works in most cases. So what I'm going to do now is go ahead and select this entire fence all at once. And to do that, once again, I'm going to find a nice little angle. I'm also going to press my full screen button here up in my zero brush menu, just so we have a little more screen real estate to work with. And actually, I think if I press 3 to go into left view, and I press B to do a border select, I think we'll be able to grab all this a lot easier. There we go. So now what we're going to do is clone mirror this selection because we want to be able to duplicate this but also mirror it at the same time. Up here with our mirror buttons, if I were to just press X, this would mirror our fence, but I don't want it just to mirror it. I want it to clone and mirror. So to do that, we'll click this button that says mirror and it will temporarily change to clone. And so when we tap X, now this will clone mirror this. And if we press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, we now have this clone mirrored onto the side of here. And what I'm going to do is line this up to where these two bars just about meet. And I'm going to select one of these fence posts and shift select all the other parts of it. So if I press Z to go into wireframe, we can see that that's the only thing selected. Okay, so I'll tap Z to go back into solid viewport shading. And then I'm going to press D to duplicate this. Right click to snap the newly duplicated thing back to exactly where it was. So then I can press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and get it to cover up that part where the bars meet. Okay, I think it's starting to look more like a cemetery, which, I don't know, maybe we'll make a cemetery. Why not? Well, let's go back into 3 to go back into left view. I'm going to press B to do a border select and try to select all of these things all at once here. And that worked out. Now I'm going to press 5 to go into top view. I'm going to press G to grab and position this more better than where it was. Okay, so we're going to be in need of another clone mirror operation here. So if you're not sure which direction you want to clone mirror something, you can always just experiment with pressing one of the actual mirror buttons first. So let's see, is it Y that we need to go? And we can see, yes, I would like that, but duplicated. So what we're going to do is press Y to get that back to how it was, or you could just press Control Z. And now we're going to cock this gun because we know we need to press Y to when we clone mirror. So we'll press that. The clone mirror process is complete, so we can press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and bring this over. And we'll give it a little space. Maybe that's a gate in between there. Because yeah, now that I think about it, there's not really much of a way to get in there. Let's press 5 to go into top view. Looks like we're going to need to move the whole thing down a little bit. So what I'm going to do is hold C, which brings up my circle selection brush. So while you're holding C, you can click your mouse and drag it over anything, and this will sort of paint on a selection. And I'm just going to paint over by holding C and left clicking across here and make sure all this other stuff is added to our selection. Now, if we press B to do a border selection, This will automatically deselect everything else that was previously selected and just select what's within the borders. So we don't want that, because if I do that, that will select only what was in the border and deselect everything else. So I'll press Ctrl Z to undo that. So for these situations, using the circle select by holding C usually works pretty good. But let's go ahead and tap Z to make sure we've got everything selected we want. And whoops, looks like we got some stragglers. So let's shift select these two posts here to make sure we've got everything selected. Great, we do. Press Z to go back into solid viewport shading. 5 to go into top view. G to grab, middle mouse to constrain. And let's just line this up a little better while we have it all selected. Now, if this were a video slightly in the future, what I would do is make a group out of these objects, and it would make things way easier to select all these objects whenever we need, but we're not quite ready for that. All right. Now what I would like to do is add a door to the front of this. So what I'm going to do is, actually, with this big cube selected, I'm just going to press D to duplicate, middle mouse to constrain, and bring it out, S to scale. And I guess this is going to be the door entrance, actually. So we'll have it something like this. Then let's press D to duplicate, middle mouse to constrain, S to scale. And this will be the first door. Let's press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to get this to be smaller. So I press G just now, middle mouse to constrain. To pull it out some, S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. And let's flatten this up real good. Then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. And that way we've got like a more slender door here. G to grab, middle mouse to constrain. So we can go ahead and bring this back. And I'll make 2 doors. So I'll press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, bring that over. Then press D to duplicate this right here. And this will be the second door. And I'll select this first one. Maybe this first one is open a little bit. So to make this open a little bit, what I'm going to do is use the quick hide button. If you double tap tab, what this will do is hide everything in the entire scene but what you have selected. And this is similar to something that's available in Blender called a local view, except for whenever you press it, it doesn't automatically zoom in on whatever you're hiding. As soon as you want to get everything back, you can double tap tab again and everything comes back. So this is super useful. So what I'm going to do is double tap tab again. And as we learned about in my old man story a little while ago, if we change the origin point of this door object to the side, then that means whenever we do transformations, such as rotation, things will be a lot easier for us. So I'm going to zoom in up on the side of this by holding Control and tapping middle mouse to do a precise zoom. And then first I'm just going to shift right click to see where this cursor snaps to, and it's down there. Okay, great. So then I'm going to shift double right click near there, and that will add that origin point to wherever I clicked it. And because I know this is a door and I'm never going to be wanting to rotate it in any other direction but Z, I'm going to open up my dimensions and I'm going to lock X and Y rotations for this selected object. So now whenever I press R to rotate, this will only ever rotate like a door, which is awesome. Okay, so we're done here. Let's double tap tab to get back to our whole world here. And I'll press R to rotate this, and this door is maybe just a little creepily opened. And yes, there's nothing that it's really going into because we're just dealing with a very simple kind of scene here. Just stay with me. And let's go ahead and click this foyer and press G to grab, middle mouse constrain, and maybe bring it back a little. Now what I'm going to do is shift right click up here so that my cursor will snap to the center of this foyer thing. And let's add, press Shift A and under Mesh, let's add another cylinder. Which, whoa, that's huge. Kind of looks cool with that ambient occlusion though. And I'm going to press 1 to go into front view. And what I want is for the cylinder to be facing me. So whenever you use a tool in Blender or you add an object, you can find additional options and controls for that tool you just used or that object you just added here in this operator menu by clicking this button. You can see it says add cylinder because that's what we just did a second ago. So we can change things like radius, how big it is, depth, how tall it is and stuff like that. But one that I'm looking for is align to view, which means that once I press align to view, it will face the direction I'm looking at it. Another way to get to this same exact menu, and it's the way that I like to get to it, is rather than pressing that little plus sign, I'll go ahead and drag that close, is as soon as you add something, you can double tap space and get access to those same options. So I'll click align to view, and now it's facing me in the direction I want. We can also do things like adjust the amount of vertices which it is composed of. So basically its sides. So we can make it, a little rounder. So that looks pretty good there. And another thing to keep in mind is that these menus do go away as soon as you do something like move your object or go to another tool. So they're only there for a very short time after you add the object. So if you want to change something about a tool you just used or an object you just added, as soon as you do it, double tap space or bring up this menu, which you can leave open if you want. It's open by default in Blender, but it annoys me most of the time. So I'll press S to scale this down, and I'll tap middle mouse to hop myself back into perspective view from the orthographic view, which all of the top number keys are orthographic views. And sometimes you might notice when coming from an orthographic view like that, when we were in front view, when I press 1 to go back into front view, sometimes you might notice that when you tap middle mouse, you're disoriented. You don't know what's going on. And that's because there's occasionally a conflict with the perspective view, which we're normally in, and the flat orthographic views when you jump out. So if that ever happens and you're coming out of one of those views and you feel like, oh, what's going on? Where am I? All you have to do is hold Alt and tap your middle mouse button, and this will zoom you in on whatever you have selected and reorientate your view. So I'm going to press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and bring this over this kind of door area, and I'm going to press S to scale. Well, I suppose I should have scaled it first, and then G to grab, middle mouse to constrain. And actually, I'll bring this out and press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and flatten it a little bit, just because it bugs me, the idea of it sticking far so back in there. So I'll press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, and then put it back. So now I've got a nice little window top or something to this door, which looks pretty cool. Actually, let's press G to grab, middle mouse to constrain, pull it back a little bit, and let's temporarily disable high def shading so we can make sure this is smooth. So I'm going to once again use the auto smooth option, which lets me control the angle of the smoothing, which is helpful. So, okay, we've got something like that. Feeling good about that. So let's turn high def shading back on. And I'm going to press D to duplicate this again, middle mouse to constrain, and then S to scale. So now we've got even more detail on this thing, which I think is cool. Yep, I think this is definitely starting to become a cemetery. But I still want to add a chimney to this roof. So what I'm going to do is hold Alt and right click to temporarily disable 3D cursor snapping. Otherwise, if I just clicked on here, it would automatically snap to the center origin point of this top weird roof thing that we made, that we sort of have hidden here. So I'll press Alt right click to move this to a location on the roof where I want to add the chimney. And I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a cylinder shape. And go ahead and turn on auto smooth shading for that. S to scale to get it down to size to begin with. And then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to scale it out vertically. And I'm not going to be dealing with this a lot, so I'm not going to worry about resetting its origin point to be, more useful for me. And then I'm going to shift right click up here to get my 3D cursor to sit in the dead center of the top of that. And then I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a cone. Super big. Press S to scale that down. This will be the top of my little chimney thing. And G to grab, middle mouse to constrain to bring that up. Maybe S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, make it a bit more pointy. And go ahead and turn on auto smooth shading for that. But this time looks like I'm going to have to adjust that value because it looks like it's going overkill. So let's see. Let's disable high def shading for now. And yeah, looks like just a little bit up to 12 is the sweet spot on that to where that looks best. Okay, I like my high def shading, so I'm going to turn it back on. All right, since I'm having fun with the idea of this being a graveyard, I'm going to add some tombstones out here. So I'm going to hold Alt and right click down here to disable cursor snapping and move this cursor just down to the ground. Press Shift A and under Mesh, I'm going to add a UV sphere. And I'm going to add smooth shading. I'm going to press S to scale. And as you can see, this ambient occlusion effect isn't perfect because even though we added smooth shading to that sphere, it looks kind of blocky, but whatever, it still looks pretty cool for the most part. And this is just to help us while we're modeling. So I'm going to press S to scale. Let's get this way down. Then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain to make it more like a stone. S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. And just get it to where it's something like this. Let's press D, duplicate that, shift select that, maybe move it back a little bit. Maybe it's just a row of 3 of them. Shift select all of these, D to duplicate, D to duplicate again, and one more duplication. Maybe get these a little more. And they don't have to be perfect here. Actually, what I'm going to do is turn on this manipulator widget so that I can add a little bit of variation to each one of these real easily. Just by rotating them a bit. Like maybe they've been settling into the dirt a little while. So they look a little, disheveled a little bit here and there. And stuff like this, the transform widget is pretty useful. It's just there's no way I can deal with that thing being on all the time. I can't. I mean, maybe some of them are like slightly bigger or slightly out of shape or something. All right, that looks pretty good. Now what I want to do is add something like hills in the background. So I'm going to disable my manipulator widget there. I'm going to press Alt right click to move my cursor without it snapping to the object it's touching, which would be this giant plane. I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add a UV sphere, add smooth shading to it, then press S to scale, middle mouse to constrain, and constrain this along the Z-axis so I've got this kind of big flat mound out here. Then I'm just going to duplicate this a bunch and scale it and just constrain these transformations to where they're, not all the same. So some of them coming up vertically a bit, some of them jutting out a ways. Then I'm going to shift select this little bit of them, press Z to go into wireframe, make sure I've only selected what I want. Then press 5 to go into top view, G to grab. I'm just going to rotate this mass of them, and I'm going to duplicate it a few times, and rotate or scale, and maybe scale middle mouse to constrain, and switch this up a little bit here and there. Add some variation. Maybe some height variation to this group. Just have something interesting to look at in the background here. And maybe bring one more up. Press D to duplicate, middle mouse to constrain, bring this guy down here. S to scale. Now what I want to do is add something like trees. So to do that, I'm going to Alt right click down here to move the cursor. And I'm going to press Shift A and under Mesh, add another cylinder. Turn on some auto smooth shading there. And as I've seen with all this other stuff, the default value of 32 is good, so no need to disable HD shading. So I'm going to press S to scale. And then S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. So we've got sort of the base of this tree here. Then I'm going to shift right click to the top of there. So when I add this cone, it will be right there. So Shift A under Mesh, add a cone. Turn on auto smooth shading for that. And as I recall, the value that it looked good at was around 12. Something like that. S to scale. S to scale middle mouse to constrain. Make sure it's going along the Z axis there. And so we've got something like that. And I'm going to press G to grab, middle mouse constrain, and bring this guy on inside of this fence. And I'll press D to duplicate this. Maybe S to scale, middle mouse to constrain. And maybe rotate it a little bit. And duplicate all of this. Maybe this one, just the tree part is a bit flatter and bigger at the bottom. Something like that. And shift select that bottom, D to duplicate that, move it over. So what I'm going to do is shift select all of these. Z to go into wireframe. Oh, looks like I missed something, so I'll shift select that bit there. Z to go back into solid viewport shading. And I'm going to press 5 to go into top view, and I'm just going to duplicate this little smattering of trees we made, rotate them around, scale them some. Maybe duplicate a few more and make even a bigger little group there. We got some that are a bit higher. And I'm gonna press C to use my circle select brush and select all this part of this new group. Z to go into wireframe. Looks like I accidentally selected some stuff. So you can also deselect with your circle select brush by holding C and then tapping down middle mouse button instead of with the left click, and that will let you paint over what you don't want selected. Looks like I also missed that little trunk there, so I'll shift select that to add that to that selection. Press Z to go back into solid viewport shading. Let's make some copies of this. So let's press 5 to go into top view. I'm going to press D to duplicate this, S to scale, R to rotate, D to duplicate that, rotate that around. That's somewhere like that. D to duplicate that. Maybe there's a much smaller group back here somewhere. Something like that. And let's get some of these going on some of these hills. So I'm going to press D to duplicate this, G to grab, bring it over. And this is one of those situations, I think, where the manipulator widget would help. So let's click that on. And we can use these little arrows to give it a slight little nudge, move it over, bring it down, and maybe rotate these guys over, because since they're sticking slightly outside of that hill, which sort of makes sense, sort of doesn't. It's like kind of a stylistic choice there. And we'll duplicate that. G to grab. Maybe rotate these guys back. Maybe S to scale. Maybe I'll flip these around altogether. Press my X mirror. S to scale. Maybe it's a bunch of real short ones up here. And let's press D to duplicate this. And maybe just put one set up here. I think one's missing back there too. So I'll press 5 to go into top view. D to duplicate, get it back there. G to grab, middle mouse to constrain. All right, so I've got a pretty sweet little scene set up here. I think I might be about ready to render this out and upload it. So I'm going to turn off my 3D widget there, and I'm going to press this full screen button to get out of full screen. And so down here in the director's chair area, of course, whatever this camera sees is what will be rendered out. So I'm going to click on this middle building here. So whenever I hold my middle mouse button down to rotate, that's what the camera will rotate around. And I'm just going to search for kind of a cool little angle here to maybe render out. Like I said earlier, you can feel free to render this in Blender Render or Cycles or add lamps if you want, but we're going to try to shy away from using environment images or materials. We just want to keep this real simple and see what kind of maybe complex scene can we make using nothing but these simple primitive shapes here. So I'm going to go ahead and render this out in Blender Render. This would look a lot better if I did have ambient occlusion on. So under lights here, I'm going to turn on ambient. And if I move my little menu over here, I'm going to adjust this ambient value, make it a bit darker. Don't want it to be too dark. Something like that. As you can see, it's changing live in the 3D view in the little camera area. This will be a representation of what actually happens when we render. Or we can get even a better example by pressing our render preview button here. All right. Okay, that angle looks pretty cool. And I'm going to go ahead and bring this value all the way up to 100%, because what this will do, this little slider does, is it will render out this image at whatever percentage of your final size you have set. So by default, under dimensions, we have 1920 by 1080. So if I were to press render, this would have rendered 55% of that, which that would be, it's a little over half of 1920 by 1080, but I want to do it a full size, so we'll bring that all the way up to 100%, and I'm going to go ahead and render this out. And I can already tell that's looking way too dark. The ambient occlusion is, I set up way too high, so I'm going to press X to cancel that. And under lights here, under this ambient value, I'm going to drop that way down. There we go. Let's try it now. Okay, so this is finished rendering out and looks pretty cool in this big 1920 by 1080 picture here. Looks like the ambient occlusion was still too dark. I think I would like instead my shadows to be a bit darker. So what I'm going to do is click on this lights menu again, and I'm going to make sure that ambient value comes down. Actually, I'm going to press my render preview button so I can get a live update of what this looks like down here. And I'm going to click open the lights menu, drag it over, and obviously that ambient occlusion value needs to be higher than that. That looks pretty good, but I want the shadow darkness to be more, so I'm going to increase that. I think I like that a bit better. And I think I would also like to change the light placement here. So I'm going to click this render preview button, and I'm going to press go back here. And by default in Sensei format, your default scene light, your lamp, is kept hidden in the outliner so that we don't have to see it in the 3D view while we're working. But we can always get access to that by coming here and clicking this eye icon, which will then display our lamp. So what I'm going to do is grab this, and I'm going to press R to rotate, and G to grab, and move this guy around, because it would be really cool to see those shadows, especially on the trees and the tombstones and the fence and such, be pointing towards a different direction. And I want to see what this looks like rendered out, but I definitely don't feel like waiting for a full 1920 by 1080 render to come. So I'm going to drop this down to about 30% so I can do a quick render, or 35%, that's fine. And that will be a lot faster and see what's going on here. So I'm going to press my render button. And as you can see, this is a lot smaller. But also I think I'm zoomed out a little bit. You can always make sure you're looking at your render at the exact pixel size by coming here where it says view and clicking zoom 1:1. Oh, guess that's 35%. We're just gonna have to scroll up and zoom in there and see it a little pixelated. I'm definitely liking the lighting on this render much better. So for instance, if we go back to slot 4, obviously this is a much better render because we did it a lot bigger, but there's this like really way too dark spots here that look a lot better in this one. I'm going to click on this lights menu, and I'm going to adjust these exposure and gamma values, which these can actually be adjusted after you render, along with this contrast bar. Maybe increase contrast a little bit. Or not. All right, that looks pretty good. I'm gonna go ahead and bring this up to 100%, render this out, and then we'll save it, and I'm gonna go post it on the Crash Course Work Review forum. Actually, you know what? Before I render this, I think I'm gonna change the lens in the camera. If I had like a really wide angle lens on this, I think it would fit the vibe of this scene better. So I'm gonna click on camera, and where it says lens size, I'm gonna change this to 20 millimeters instead of 35. And this of course zooms me way out. So I'm going to have to zoom back in. To do that, I'm going to do precise zoom. I'm going to hold Control and middle mouse button. And I'm going to click back on that main part of the building there. And you know what? Ooh, actually, with this 20 millimeter lens, I'm finding some angles that might be a little bit sweeter. Maybe we're looking at it through the trees. Okay, I think I'm pretty happy with that right there. I'm going to render this out, and then we'll go post it online over at the forums. All right, that's finished rendering. Of course, you can make any panel in Blender full screen by pressing the tilde key. That's the little squiggly line key underneath the escape key on your keyboard. So let's press that up here, and now we can see this full rendered image out here. And this looks pretty sweet. So I'm going to go ahead and press Save Image, and I'm going to change this to JPEG because it's got to be uploaded to the internet, and click on my desktop bookmark so it'll be saved there, and I'll just call this Primitive Transform Challenge, and then underscore and whatever the name of it is, so I guess Graveyard. And press Save as Image. And so now if I hop on over to my web browser at blendersensei.com, I'm going to log in as my test user, which is Boba Fett. This is the account I always use to do tests on the site. And I'm going to log in as that. And here I am there. So I'm going to head over to the forums. And this forum, by the way, will only be visible to people who are logged into the site. So I'm going to click on Crash Course Worker Review here. And I'm going to go ahead and make the topic where everyone should post their renders if they complete this tutorial and feel like posting whatever they made. So let's call this Primitive. Ah, geez, I spelled that wrong, didn't I? Let's see. Yep, whoops. Rename that. And we'll call this the Primitive Transform Challenge. And I'll probably come back here and fill out some rules about this, or guidelines, whatever. And whenever you're uploading stuff to the site, all you do is you click Choose File here, and then you want to, whoa, that's really big. Select whatever you're uploading, press Open, and then whenever you go to post your reply or topic or whatever, that's when it will actually upload. And so I'm going to press Post Topic. And here it is. So there's my render there. So yeah, I made this sort of neat little graveyard scene using nothing but primitives and sweet transform skills. But you could make something close to this or exactly like this, or you could elaborate on this or make something totally different. Like I'd be interested in seeing like crazy swords, or maybe some sort of gun, or like a spaceship, or a small city, who knows, whatever you want to build, it's totally up to you. The goal here is that we open our minds to the possibilities of what we can accomplish using transform methods that we've been talking about in this video and in the last video as well. And of course, I rendered this out in Blender Render, but if you prefer to render it out in cycles, you're more than welcome to do that. And if you're familiar with how lamps work, feel free to add your own lighting sources, jazz stuff up in whatever way you want. But the idea is that we keep it grayscale, black and white basically, and we're not adding any materials or environments and junk like that. Well, that about wraps us up for now. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next tutorial.